Hi boys and girls, so today I'm going to read a story called Flat Stanley. And this has to do with the project that I sent you called the Flat Teacher Project, Flat Miss Mary-Kaye. Why do you guys think Stanley is flat? Think about that for a minute. Alright. Hey, come look, Arthur Longchomp called from the bedroom he shared with his brother Stanley. Mr. and Mrs. Longchomp cared greatly for politeness and correct speech. Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people, said Mrs. Longchomp. But look, said Arthur, pointing. Across Stanley's bed lay the enormous bulletin board. It had fallen on Stanley during the night. Mr. and Mrs. Longchomp hurried to lift it from the bed, but Stanley wasn't hurt. What's going on here? He said cheerfully, sitting up. Heavens, cried Mrs. Longchomp. Gosh, said Arthur, Stanley's flat. As a pancake, said Mr. Longchomp. Darndest thing I've ever seen. Mrs. Longchomp sighed and said, Let's all have breakfast, then we'll hear what Dr. Dan has to say. So he's not hurt, he's just flat, huh? In his office, Dr. Dan exclaimed, Stanley, how do you feel? He asked. I felt sort of tickly after I got up, Stanley said, but I feel fine now. Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases, said Dr. Dan. The nurses took Stanley's measurements. He was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and 1/2 inch thick. So he's only about this thick. Same height, same width, just only this thick. Being flat could be fun. Stanley enjoyed going in and out of rooms by sliding through the cracks at the bottom of the door. Arthur tried to, but he just banged his head. Being flat could be exciting during the holidays. Stanley was invited to visit his friend Thomas in California. Mr. Longchomp brought home an enormous brown paper envelope and said, Stanley, try this on for size. The envelope fit Stanley perfectly, and the next morning his parents slid him into it, along with an egg salad sandwich, and mailed him from the box on the corner. Would you want to go across the country in an envelope like that? I wouldn't. Stanley had a fine time in California. Thomas's family returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. They marked it airmail and wrote valuable and this end up on both sides. That way people would be very, very careful with Stanley. There he is, back from California. In the park one afternoon, Stanley and Arthur watched some boys flying big kites. Someday, Arthur said, I would like to have a big kite. You can fly me, Arthur, Stanley said. Come on. He gave Arthur a spool of string and attached the string to himself. Then he ran across the grass to catch the wind. Up, up, up went Stanley. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees. Everyone stood still to watch. Would you want to be a kite and flying up in the air? But Arthur got tired of running with the empty spool, wedging it in the fork of a tree. He went off for a hot dog. He didn't notice when Stanley became tangled in the branches of one of the trees. Half an hour passed before Arthur heard Stanley's shouts and climbed up to set him free. Uh-oh, he got stuck. Arthur apologized over and over again that evening, but Stanley was still cross. The next morning, Mr. Longchomp and Stanley met their neighbor, Mr. O.J. Dart, director of the famous Museum of Art. Dr. Dart looked worried. Another valuable painting was stolen from the famous museum last night. He told Stanley and his father, the police suspect a gang of sneak thieves. They work at night by sneakery, which makes them very difficult to catch. Stanley had an idea. He explained it to Mr. Dart. Excellent, said Mr. Dart. We'll try out your plan tonight. What do you think Stanley's idea is for Mr. Dart? How do you think he can help him catch the thieves? That evening, in the main hall of the museum, Mr. Dart showed Stanley the most expensive painting in the world. Next to it was an empty picture frame. "And now," Stanley said, "Mr. Dart, it's time for your disguise." Stanley showed Mr. Dart the disguise he bought. "This is a really good one, my cowboy hat and a red bandana." "I'm sorry," Mr. Dart said, "but we don't have a cowboy pictures here. You must wear the disguise I have chosen." What's the disguise that he has chosen? A dress, right? And a hat and a wig of hair. Stanley could hardly speak when he saw Mr. Dart's disguise. "I'll look like a girl," he protested, but Stanley was a good sport, so he put it on. In the main hall, Stanley climbed into the empty picture frame and stood very still. "Very nice," said Mr. Dart, and went off to arrange the rest of their plan. Now Stanley was alone. The hall was very dark, but enough moonlight came through the windows for him to see the world's most expensive painting. "Maybe the sneak thieves won't come," he thought. Then, creak! Here's Stanley in his outfit, in his disguise. A glow of yellow light shone suddenly in the center of the hall. A trap door had opened in the floor. The sneak thieves carried lanterns, came up into the hall. So they're coming in through a trap door. The thieves took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. "This is it, Max," said the first thief, whose name was Luther. "In all of this great city, there is no one to suspect us." Then Luther saw Stanley in his frame. "I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max," he said. "This one looks scared." Stanley managed a teeny smile. "She is smiling, sort of," Max said. "And what a pretty little thing she is, too." That made Stanley furious. Do you know what furious means? Mad or angry. In his loudest voice, he shouted, "Police! Mr. Dart! The sneak thieves are here!" "Max," Luther whispered, "I think I heard the sheep girl yell." "Oh boy, yelling pictures! We both need a rest," Max whispered back. "You'll get a rest all right," shouted Mr. Dart, rushing in with lots of policemen. "You'll get arrested, that's what." The sneak thieves were quickly handcuffed and led away to jail. The next morning, Stanley Longchop got a gold medal from the chief of police. The day after that, his picture was in the newspaper. For a while, Stanley was famous. People would point him out and whisper, "Over there, Agnes, Stanley Longchop, the one who caught the museum robbers," and things like that. But then people began to make fun of him. "Hi, Super Skinny," they would call. That's not very nice, is it? Late one night, Arthur woke to the sound of Stanley crying. "What's wrong?" he said. Stanley sighed. "I want to be a regular shape again, like the other people. It's not fair." "You're brave," said Arthur. "You really are." And then Arthur had an idea. He turned on the light and ran to the big toy box in the corner. He tossed aside toy soldiers, airplanes, and boatmobiles. "Got it," he said, holding up an old bicycle pump. What do you think Arthur's going to do with the bicycle pump? "Okay," Stanley said after a moment, "but take it easy." He stood with the end of the hose in his mouth, clamping his lips tightly so no air could escape. Arthur began to pump. "If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hand," he said. Stanley's top half began to swell. Stanley got bigger and bigger and bigger. His pajama buttons bursted off. Pop, pop, pop. Soon he was all around out except for his right foot. He shook the foot twice, and it swelled to match the other one. There stood Stanley Longchop as if he had never been flat at all. "Thank you, Arthur," Stanley said. "Thank you very much." Mr. and Mrs. Longchop came in to see what the boys were up to so late at night. "George," said Mrs. Longchop, "Stanley's round again." "I'm the one who did it," Arthur said. "I blew him up." Mrs. Longchop made hot chocolate to celebrate, and several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Longchop tucked the brothers back into bed and turned out the light. "Good night," they said. "Good night," said Stanley and Arthur. Very soon, all the Longchops were asleep. The end. So, I have sent your parents all Flat Miss Mary-Kaye. So I want you guys to cut it out. You can decorate it. You can cut a different one out each day. You can make me have Wacky Wednesday crazy hair and things like that. You can put me in GA spirit wear or the beach day. It could go along with our themes this week too, okay? So, cut me out, take some pictures, and send them to me, okay? Bye, guys.